Did you know that the man who provided the rifles to the San Bernardino shooters also broke California state law by transferring rifles that have been modified without an FFL? Since the laws that were already on California's books didn't work, how would more gun control have prevented the San Bernardino shooting? Why does California have a lot of shootings such as the San Bernardino, Isla Vista, Santana High School, and the McDonald's massacre, just to name a few, despite having the strictest gun control laws in the country? If gun control laws aren't working in your cities or in California, how will they work in the rest of the country? Why should we not be suspicious that the same people who want to implement gun regulations that have failed in Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and California are the same people who want to implement economic policies that have failed in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Vietnam, Cambodia, China, North Korea, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, and Zimbabwe? Is it a coincidence that the same states where the Brady campaign has had the most success, California, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Illinois, are the same states where there are more people moving out than there are people moving in? If criminals in Chicago and Washington, D.C. are actually getting their guns from neighboring states, why do those neighboring states not have the same crime rate or a higher crime rate? Who will you blame for your city's violent gun crime if the rest of the U.S. has strict gun control laws and the criminals in your city still have their guns? Why do you blame neighboring states and cities for your failed policies? By your logic, shouldn't your gun control utopia Canada be plagued with gun violence because it borders a lot of U.S. states that already have lax gun laws? Have you ever tried to buy a gun in a neighboring state? Have you ever been to a gun show? Then how can you argue that the gun show loophole exists if you haven't been to a gun show? Why do you want to close a fictional loophole when not one mass shooter in history ever acquired his gun from a gun show? Can you actually name one instance where a convicted felon or convicted domestic abuser got a gun from a licensed dealer, and the dealer and the authorities said that under a certain loophole he was allowed to have that gun? Can you even cite any loopholes in the law regarding the sale or use of firearms? Did the school you go to teach American history that wasn't distorted? If yes, did you even bother paying attention? When David Hogg said "Welcome to the Revolution" at a March for Our Lives rally, have you idiots forgotten how the first revolution was fought and won? Did the school you go to even teach you about the Second Amendment? Did the school you go to, such as the one I went to, lie that there were no Supreme Court cases involving the Second Amendment when in fact there were? Do you celebrate the 4th of July? If yes, why do you celebrate a bunch of old white men leading other white men in an armed revolution against a big government? If a bunch of white men revolted against the government today because they were tired of ridiculous taxes, would you compare them to the Founding Fathers, or would you call them anti-government terrorists? Why do you say that people who have guns because they fear the government will become tyrannical are paranoid idiots, while you go on saying that Trump is the new Hitler? Why do you trash talk America for atrocities that the U.S. government was responsible for, such as Native American wars, the displacement of Native Americans, Jim Crow laws, dropping atomic bombs on Japan, dropping napalm on Vietnam, police violence, the wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the destabilization of Libya and other countries, but yet you want that same government to have a monopoly on guns, healthcare, and education? If you are willing to admit that the U.S. government is corrupt, which it is, then why should they have all the guns? Why do you want to give more and more power to that same government? Knowing all the horrors the U.S. government has done, if you still want that same government to have authority over who is allowed to own a gun and what kind of guns can and can't be owned, as well as run your healthcare and subsidize college tuitions, my question is, are you an idiot or an evil genius? Has it ever occurred to you that since the dawn of civilization, governments have been responsible for more deaths than any civilian ever could be? In fact, are you aware that in the 20th century alone, governments across the world killed over 170 million people? Did you know that everything you accuse the NRA of doing, the United States government has actually done? Are you aware that the United States government that you want to come and take our semi-automatic rifles has been selling automatic weapons and other military equipment to third world tyrants and militias since the Cold War? More importantly, do you care? Did you know that during World War II, your beloved FDR and his successor, Harry Truman, gave weapons, money, and aid to Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong in their fight against the Japanese? Would you mind telling me what responsible gun owners they were? Did you know that in the 1950s, the United States government gave training and weapons to the Viet Minh before they became known as the Viet Cong? Did you know that during the Iraq-Iran border war in the 1980s, the Reagan administration gave weapons, money, and aid to Saddam Hussein and his regime? Ooh, I bet George Bush can tell me how responsible he was with weapons. Did you know that during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Reagan administration also gave weapons, training, money, and aid to the Mujahideen before they formed into groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda? Did you know that in 2014, Iraqi soldiers abandoned their posts and left a lot of U.S.-provided weapons and equipment that ISIS took for themselves? Why was the U.S. government not held accountable for that? Why have you not held Barack Obama and Eric Holder accountable for the Fast and Furious scandal? Why is it wrong for Americans to own semi-automatic AR-15s, but it's perfectly okay for the U.S. government to sell automatic M16s to the corrupt, oppressive governments of Greece, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Yemen, Lebanon, Turkey, the Philippines, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Thailand, El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, Morocco, Tunisia, Niger, Chad, Kenya, Equatorial Guinea, and Angola, as well as the politically correct governments of Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Canada, and Australia. Do you think those countries underwent a background check before Uncle Sam gave them those guns? Will you ever advocate for background checks for foreign soldiers and militias before they get U.S.-provided weapons? You already don't. Why should us Americans go through background checks to own guns, but the government can give guns to third world barbarians with no questions asked? Why did you not hold the Obama administration accountable for giving arms to Syrian rebels who hurt women and children and had ties to ISIS? If your answer is because they're fighting an oppressive government, then should American gun owners fight the U.S. government if they think they're being oppressed? Did you know that the Russian government is also selling automatic AK-47s to the tyrants of Belarus, Syria, Myanmar, Malaysia, China, Vietnam, Turkmenistan, Cyprus, Libya, Sudan, Uganda, and Venezuela? Again, do you care? While you still nag about what Russia didn't do, why are you turning a blind eye to what Russia actually is doing? Did you know that both the American and Russian governments are selling automatic weapons and other military equipment to the unpredictable and corrupt governments of Mexico, Brazil, Egypt, Ghana, Cameroon, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Jordan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and Indonesia? Why are the psychopathic dogs of the third world allowed to run around with guns to terrorize their subjects and keep them in check? But I, an American civilian, shouldn't be allowed to own a semi-automatic rifle to protect myself from the government that supplies other rogue governments. Why is it wrong for Americans to own semi-automatic rifles, but you're okay with Iran having nuclear weapons despite Iran's clear intentions with them? Given how irresponsible the U.S. government is with guns, why do you want them to solve the gun violence problem? And why should they be allowed to decide who can or can't own a gun and what kind of guns can or can't be legal, given how irresponsible they are? And why don't any of your gun control proposals apply to the government? Can you tell me one thing besides an armed population that will deter a government from becoming too tyrannical? If us gun owners can't outfight the government because the government has airplanes, helicopters, tanks, and missiles, then how do you explain the failed wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan? If the government and all its military might couldn't defeat a bunch of peasants and farmers with AK-47s in 3 separate conflicts, how well will they do against armed and angry American patriots? If gun-toting Americans can't stand up against the government, how do you explain the Clive and Bundy standoff in 2014? If you don't think gun-toting citizens can remove a tyrannical government from power, how do you explain the Battle of Athens, Tennessee in 1946? Have you ever read the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by D. Brown? If not, then you should. Did you know that just before the government soldiers enacted the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, they inspected the entire reservation and took all the natives' weapons? Ooh, that can't be a coincidence. Did you know that there were no armed Native American men present during the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864? Did you know that the soldiers who committed that slaughter waited for the armed men to go out hunting so that the unarmed women and children would be left defenseless? I'd also like to point out that that tribe, the Arapaho and the Cheyenne who were massacred at Sand Creek, were also under government protection at the time, but I don't expect that to mean anything to you. Did you know that after the Native Americans submitted to the government, they had all their weapons confiscated? Did you know that after Native Americans submitted to the government and handed in all their weapons, that the government violated all of the land treaties made with them? Ooh, that can't be a coincidence. How can you say the United States government will never violate the rights of people it doesn't like when they already did that to the Native Americans? Shouldn't the history of Native Americans be a wake-up call for why you shouldn't trust the government to take care of you? What if I told you that the majority of the violence in the so-called Wild West was initiated by the government and not outlaws and cowboys as depicted in Hollywood? What will stop the U.S. government from violating more of our rights once they have all their guns? After all the gun control laws you want to pass, are you going to come for our knives, like the British government did to their citizens? Why do you call Trump the new Hitler for the way he talks about illegal immigrants and Muslim terrorists, when that is exactly how people like you talk about gun owners, NRA members, conservatives, libertarians, Christians, white men, hunters, private schools, homeschoolers, and everything else you don't like? Why do you always point out how white men do a lot of killing when black men kill, particularly young black men, kill each other and people of other races at a higher rate than white men do, despite the fact that blacks in general only represent less than 13% of America's overall population? Why are you always talking about killings committed by white men when Muslim men, most of whom were from Saudi Arabia, were behind the 9/11 attacks, therefore having the highest body count of all ethnic and religious groups and having the highest body count in a single incident? Since you love bringing up the problem of white men killing a handful of people, what, may I ask, is your solution? Did you know that the greatest mass killing of Americans on American soil outside of war was actually 9/11? Did you know that the greatest school massacre in American history, which was in 1927, where a homemade fertilizer bomb was used to kill 38 school children in Bath Township, Michigan? How will gun control stop these kinds of horrors? What if I told you that the worst school shooting in world history didn't even happen in the US, but in Russia, despite the fact that Russia has tighter gun control laws than the US? Would you like to know what kind of people were responsible for the Beslan school massacre in Russia in 2004? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't white supremacists or fundamentalist Christians. Why do you keep saying nobody says they want to ban all guns when you keep saying Trump wants to exterminate Latinos despite the fact that he never said such a thing? The former, I can show you video evidence of people saying. If bolt-action rifles become a more common tool for psychopaths to use in political assassinations, are you going to put more restrictions on bolt-action rifles and scopes? With countries like India, Indonesia, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo having problems with poachers killing protected species in parks and reserves where hunting is prohibited, should those countries enforce the laws they already have or make more laws? If your answer is that they should enforce the laws they already have, why don't you apply those same standards to illegal guns in American cities? If gun manufacturers and retailers are irresponsible and careless, then why are guns safe sold at every gun retailer I've been to? If gun manufacturers are as irresponsible and apathetic towards kids as you claim they are, then how come every box of ammunition I've ever bought says keep out of the reach of children? Would you believe me if I told you that on December 14th, 2012, I was horrified and sad about what happened at Sandy Hook? Given that the Sandy Hook shooter stole the guns he used, how would universal background checks have prevented that shooting? In fact, can you name one shooting a universal background check would have prevented? These next few questions are for the Sandy Hook families. Why do you see the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act as a bad thing? Why not just sue the murderer for his or her crimes? Why do you not have the same hatred towards the shooter that you do for the NRA and the gun industry? On Judgment Day, who do you think God will hold accountable for the Sandy Hook shooter? The shooter himself or Wayne LaPierre? Are the gun control laws that Connecticut passed not good enough for you? How are you doing your deceased loved ones any justice by not holding the shooter accountable and going after the gun industry? Are we going to start suing car manufacturers, car dealers, and alcohol producers the next time there is a car collision involving drunk driving? Should terror attack victims and their families be allowed to sue the mosque the terrorists attended? Is the endgame of lawsuits such as yours to put gun manufacturers out of business so that people like me can't get more guns? Back to gun control activists in general, why do you call the NRA a terrorist organization but defend Antifa and Black Lives Matter? Have you ever considered that calling everything the NRA does and says that you don't like terrorism devalues the word to the point where it actually offends the people who have suffered real terrorism? Have you also considered that when you use words such as racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, tyranny, Nazi, Hitlerian, rape, and sexual assault? How dare you tell us gun owners to think about the children when animal rights extremists, which you still refuse to denounce, have threatened Ted Nugent's children for eating wild game meat? How dare you tell the NRA and NRA members like me to think about the children while you glorify and normalize abortion? How dare you tell us to think about the children when you are apathetic towards the fact that America has reached its lowest fertility rate in history? How dare you tell us to think about the children when you vilified the Covington boys for wearing MAGA hats? How dare you tell us to think about the children when people like you and just kept threatening to blow up the school the Covington boys attended, while in the same breath telling us how to think about the children and keep schools safe? How dare you tell us to think about the children when you turn a blind eye to New York State legalizing abortion just minutes before or after birth, which is actually quite disgusting? How dare you tell us to think about the children when you feminists tell young American women not to have children at all? How dare you tell us to think about the children when you turn a blind eye to children and babies, most of them boys, who are abused and or murdered by their own mothers? To all you politicians, celebrities, news anchors, and talk show hosts that tell people like me to think about the children, how many of you were Jeffrey Epstein's customers? Why is gun anarchy bad, but abortion anarchy, which is killing a baby just minutes before or after it is born, totally okay with you? Why is Kermit Gosnell a reason why we need legal and safe abortions, but every shooting is a reason we need to crack down on gun ownership? The Santa Fe shooter used a shotgun and a revolver, so what good would an assault weapons ban have done? And what good would a magazine capacity limit have done? Also, did you know that the Santa Fe shooter stole those guns from his father and that he was too young to acquire those guns legally? How will gun control laws stop an underage person from stealing a gun when stealing is already illegal? What good are magazine capacity limits when the Columbine shooters use multiple 10-round magazines? Why do you blame the NRA for mass shootings when not one mass shooter in history was an NRA member? Did you know that we already have background checks at gun purchases, including at gun shows? Did you know that if a convicted felon or domestic abuser ever acquired a gun legally, it was because his conviction wasn't submitted to the NICS background check system? So how is it the NRA's fault that, and not the government's fault, when felony convictions aren't submitted? Did you know that 38 states submit less than 80% of their felony convictions into the background check system? Did you know that the Aurora shooter, Oregon shooter, Charleston church shooter, WDBJ shooter, Santa Barbara shooter, LA Mall shooter, LA Airport shooter, DC Navy Yard shooter, Tucson shooter, Sutherland Springs shooter, Virginia Tech shooter, and both Fort Hood shooters passed a background check when they purchased their guns? Since background checks didn't stop them from going on shootings, how will more background checks work? Did you know that despite the Sutherland Springs shooter's domestic violence conviction, the Air Force didn't submit his conviction into the background check system, and that is the real reason he was able to acquire a gun he used, and not some non-existent loophole? And why didn't you people hold the Air Force accountable for that? The Sutherland Springs shooter was also militantly anti-Christian, so are atheists going to be regulated by the unpredictable government? They shouldn't. While we're on the subject of the Sutherland Springs shooting, why does the mainstream media ignore this Stephen Williford, the man who shot the Sutherland Springs shooter and stopped him? Is it because he used an AR-15 against him, the very weapon you vilify so much? Did you know that the Orlando nightclub shooter acquired the weapon he used months prior to the shooting? So what good would more waiting periods have done? In fact, what good are waiting periods at all? If the NRA and gun owners are as dangerous as you claim they are, why are you people still alive? Why do most, if not all, school shootings happen at public schools and not private or charter schools? Did you know that most school shooters were put on behavior-altering medications that they shouldn't have been on before they committed their crimes? Did you know that at public schools where a lot of school shootings happen, boys are being bullied by their female teachers because of their toxic masculinity, put on behavior-altering drugs that shouldn't even exist, misdiagnosed with autism and other developmental disorders, and treated as defective girls? Have you ever considered that that may be the real reason school shootings happen so much? Is it a coincidence that the majority of school dropouts, student academic scores plummeting, teachers mistreating boys, drugs, gangs, teen pregnancies, bullying, incompetent teachers who are never fired thanks to teachers' unions, bad kids not being disciplined, and teachers committing statutory rape against students, as well as school shootings, tend to happen mostly at public schools? Why do I have a feeling if everything mentioned in the previous question, especially school shootings, happened at private or charter schools at the rate they happen at public schools, your beloved government would be sending social workers accompanied by law enforcement to investigate and inspect private and charter schools and look for a reason to shut them down like they should be doing to public schools? Did you know that most school shooters were raised by single mothers? Did you know that most inner city gang members were also raised by single mothers? Did you know that most men and teenage boys who committed suicide with or without a gun were raised by single mothers? Now that you know, why do you blame toxic masculinity for the violence these fatherless boys and men inflict, when it is clear that lack of masculinity in their lives is what led to them being the violent subhumans they are? Would you be surprised if I told you that the 2011 Norway shooter was also physically and sexually abused by his mother, and that his father was denied custody of him by the Norwegian court system when he found out about it? If Congress were to give you all the gun control laws you've ever asked for, will you also give fathers shared or full custody of their children, especially their sons, in the event of a separation or divorce? You already don't do that. For you people who say these shootings weren't common back in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s, answer me this. How many boys had fathers during that same time period? How many boys during that time period were on behavior-altering medications? Were children in that time period spanked or put in timeout or disciplined in any way when they misbehaved at school or at home? Did you know that, contrary to popular belief, school shootings did happen throughout the 20th century, but you didn't hear about them because the media wasn't over those events like vultures on roadkill, and the government didn't politicize those shootings? If we get all the gun control laws you want, will you also fix public education, reduce the poverty rate, and fix the family unit, especially in the inner cities? Why are gun control activists like you not making or advocating for those changes now? Did you know that according to the American Heart Association, Cardiovascular diseases kill around 600,000 Americans a year. Why do those deaths not mean much to you? Did you know that the U.S. has one of the highest number of smoking-related deaths in the world, right up there with India, China, and Russia? So should the government put more and more ridiculous laws and restrictions on cigarettes? They shouldn't. Did you know that the children are more likely to die from obesity than gun violence? So shouldn't we put waiting periods and background checks on candy, chips, pizza, soda, and fast food in order to save children's lives? Why do you ignore Muslim terrorism because a white man is more likely to kill you than a Muslim, but want gun control so badly despite the fact that an American is more likely to die from a cardiovascular disease than a gunshot? With the previous question in mind, should all medical facilities get rid of anti-venom and stop teaching people to be cautious around snakes because you're more likely to get bit by your neighbor's dog than you are to get bit by a venomous snake? For feminists, why do you say that you hate rapists and domestic abusers, but discourage women from owning guns to protect themselves from rapists and abusers? Why is a woman who was raped and murdered morally superior to a woman with a smoking gun in her hand and a dead or injured rapist at her feet? Why does the NRA have gun training programs and shooting activities for women while no feminist movement has such programs? Can you explain, with a rational argument, how encouraging women to use guns to defend themselves from rapists and abusive partners is putting women in danger? How is it victim blaming if we suggest that women take responsibility for their own safety? If you really expect society to treat women and men equally, then why don't women have to take responsibility for their own safety? If a strong, independent, and empowered woman can raise kids by herself, or find a fulfilling career, or go to college, then why can't she be responsible for her own safety? Why are women strong enough to raise kids by themselves without the child's father, but not strong enough or smart enough to use a gun? Have you ever heard of a former California state senator, Leland Lee, who advocated for gun control while selling guns to criminals in California? How many Democrats who advocate for gun control are exactly like him? If police are defunded, who will enforce the gun control laws once they are passed? Why do you say guns should be regulated like cars, but oppose concealed carry licenses receiving national reciprocity like a driver's license? Regarding the Parkland shooting, why did you not hold the cop accountable for entering the school to stop the shooter? Why did you ignore the fact that the FBI was called twice about the boy who perpetrated the Parkland shooting and did nothing to follow up on those calls? And how is that the NRA's fault? Why did President Trump receive backlash for calling out the FBI on exactly that? Why do you ignore the fact that the Sheriff's Department received over 40 calls about him before the shooting, one of those calls being from the shooter himself, and did nothing? Again, how is that the NRA's fault? How dare you call the NRA a terrorist organization when you Democrats refuse to condemn violence from Antifa or Black Lives Matter? How dare you accuse the NRA of terrorism when you Democrats, especially Ilhan Omar, refuse to condemn an Antifa attack on an ICE building in Tacoma, Washington? Can you imagine if Wayne LaPierre, Ted Cruz, Glenn Beck, Dan Bongino, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Rand Paul, or Dana Lash said that gun violence is a manufactured crisis? Can you imagine if Charlie Daniels said that he thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House during Obama's inauguration, like how Madonna did during Trump's inauguration? Why was it okay for Snoop Dogg to point a gun at a clown that resembled Donald Trump in a music video? Can you imagine if Toby Keith was in a music video where he pointed a gun at a clown that resembled Barack Obama or Bill Clinton? Can you imagine if Ted Nugent described Columbine with the phrase, "some people did something"? If a loved one of a Muslim terror attack victim demanded that Islam be tightly restricted and regulated, would you stand by his or her side? What if a Muslim told the families of 9/11 victims that their dead kids don't trump his religious freedom? If semi-automatic rifles shouldn't be protected under the Second Amendment, then should Islam not be protected under the First Amendment? Whatever gun control laws you want to see passed, will welfare, immigration from third world countries, abortion, and Islam ever go under similar regulations? Richard Blumenthal once said that he believes in the Constitution, but no right is absolute. Why do I have a feeling that Democrats like him will never hold Islam, immigration, abortion, or welfare to those same standards? If you truly believe you're on the side of gun owners, then why do you depict them as untrained, irresponsible, irrational, violent, intolerant, racist, anti-Semitic, wife-beating, inbred, Sandy Hook-denying, anti-Muslim rednecks? Why do you claim that gun owners have small penises, but would never, ever in a million years hold Muslim terrorists, Central American drug cartels, and other third world militias to those same standards? Why do you say that we shouldn't judge all Muslims by the actions of a few, but you judge all gun owners by the actions of a few? Why did Obama not call for gun control when a Muslim killed 4 Marines and a sailor in Chattanooga? Why is it wrong for American Christians to cling to their guns and religion, but it's okay for Muslims to cling to theirs? How dare you accuse President Trump and the NRA of racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and terrorism while you turn a blind eye to Muslims doing exactly that? How are white terrorists in any way comparable to Muslim terrorists when most white terrorists don't even have a common ideology while all Muslim terrorists actually do? If President Trump proposed a bill that would ban Muslims from owning guns, would you support that? I wouldn't, but that's different. Would you be in favor of a bill that bans white male Christians from owning guns? By your logic, should black men be banned from owning guns because they commit the majority of the crimes in this country? Why do you let a person's skin color, religion, or political affiliation dictate how you treat them when they do something awful? What difference does it make when a shooter or a gangbanger has a certain skin color? Did you know that the mentally ill are more likely to be a victim of a violent crime instead of the perpetrator? So why should mentally ill people be barred from any constitutional right? What should the legal definition of a mental illness be? Should the legal definition of a mental illness include the delusion that Russia hacked the 2016 presidential elections to get Donald Trump elected? Regarding people on Social Security disability for mental illness being barred from owning a gun under the Obama administration and being allowed to own a gun under the Trump administration, why did you even target those people? Why were such laws necessary when not one person who was ever on Social Security disability for mental illness ever went on a shooting rampage in the first place? Why were their constitutional rights taken away by executive order and without due process? Can you imagine if President Trump signed an executive order that barred illegal immigrants from owning guns? Would you support that? If not, then aren't you a hypocrite? When Batman's parents, Spider-Man's uncle, and the Punisher's wife and kids were shot to death, why did these fictional comic book characters go after criminals and not gun owners, gun retailers, gun manufacturers, and the NRA? Don't you think it's sad that comic book heroes blame criminals for the deaths of their loved ones and not inanimate objects how you do? Speaking of the Punisher, if the Punisher actually existed in the real world we live in, would you blame his existence and his actions on the NRA? Or would you blame the criminals in the corrupt justice system like a smart person would?